Alright, flipped video for the introduction to Westward expansion. We're going to have a couple of these for Westward expansion. We're going to start out with the Great Plains. We're going to keep them short and sweet. These are just overviews. At the top of your guided reading sheet, or guided video sheet, I guess it would be called, you have a guided question that you need to be able to do. That's your big picture piece, and that's how did the natural geography of the Great Plains shape the lives of those who live there. And then you have two objectives, which are the smaller pieces. Describe the geography of the Great Plains and explain how people adapted to live on the Great Plains. If you can't do either of those two things or three things when you get done, you need to go back and rewatch the video. Those are the pieces that you need from your notes you need to be able to answer. So double check those when you get done. Make sure you can do it. So here we go. The blue on the center of that picture is not a lake. That is the region we call the Great Plains, the center of the country, extending, or center of the continent, I guess, extending up into Canada. But what we're going to look at is the basic physical features of the Great Plains. We're going to look at how people adapted, or how Americans adapted to living there, and some of the inventions that caused that to be successful. So location, you can put east of the Rocky Mountains in parentheses behind it, put center of the country, however you want to describe it, but that blue region is what we're looking at. Physical features, flatlands that basically rises gradually from east to west, but more or less if you're on top of it, you think it's flat. It's eroded by land and water because there would not that much rain, there's not that many trees. Basically a big pasture, if you think of farm territory. So when there was not a lot of water, the grass would die, and so you get a lot of erosion when it would rain. Same thing with a lot of wind that goes through the middle of the country. And erosion would cause the land to be messed up. The other thing that we're going to see is we're going to have a lot of harsh climate, so extremes one end to the other. Not very much rain, like I said before, a lot of dust storms because you have a lot of wind blowing around, and you have no rain, no vegetation, and a lot of wind. You're going to get dust, and extremely cold winters with a lot of difficulties being put on the settlers because there's no trees for protection, so the wind gets going, the snow gets blowing, and it's hard to live there. Before the Civil War, and we're going to backtrack a little bit here, basically treeless wasteland. Nobody stayed there. They went from east to west and they just left it. You had the Native Americans that lived there, but we didn't really mess with them for the most part. We just wanted to get out of there. So we're going to look at why was that different here in a second, but a couple of pictures just sort of give you an idea. This is where the buffaloes were at. This is, that third picture kind of shows what it is. Scrub, brush, maybe a bush or something, but for the most part, relatively flat, no mountain ranges or anything, and just grass as far as you could see. So what we're looking at now is why do people decide this is all of a sudden a good place to live when it wasn't before? We have an opportunity for land ownership that we never had before. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signs the Homestead Act of 1862, designed to encourage people to settle in the plains. And what that is for $10 you could go live there and you get 160 acres, provided that you stayed there and farmed it for 5 years. So basically, if you could make it 5 years, you pay your $10, you get 160 acres of land. So that means that people are interested in going there, but that alone wasn't enough. We're going to talk about later some technological advances, things like the plow, the windmill, and some of the other things that make it easier for people to live there. You could make money. If you didn't have any land, 160 acres is a lot of land. So this is like a way to get ahead. If you can go and you can work really hard and survive, then this would be a way that you could advance yourself. For the former slaves, this is sort of a new beginning. We talked a lot about them being stuck in the South. This was one way for them to get out of the South. And groups of them actually left and went to Kansas for this promise of 160 acres and land. And for some of them, it had a religious connotation. It was like Moses leading people to the promised land, and they would go in groups. But oftentimes they weren't successful. They didn't have the skills or tools or money needed to be able to survive the harsh climate. It was sort of a difficult situation for most of them, and in large numbers, they never were successful. Another reason would be adventure. Some younger men looking for adventure and a different way of life had moved to the plains. So there's kind of 5 different things that encourage people to settle there. You need to be able to have those and explain a little bit about what we're talking about with each one. Different inventions, I'm going to talk about these more in detail, but pictures for you: barbed wires, windmills. The railroad I won't talk as much about because we're going to cover that in a later video, but the railroad's extremely important because it allows goods to be moved to the plains and back to the east coast or to the west coast. So it makes travel a lot easier. Steel plows, we'll talk about later. Pictures, as far as adaptations, we got different adaptations. If you're doing your notes, this might be a little bit out of order, but we're going to talk about them later again too. So sod houses, you don't have trees and wood's expensive to come by. They used what they had, which was grass. So actual sod housing, which doesn't sound like a good idea to me, but it's better than being outside. So this is the way that people adapted to try and survive. If you think about it, you get there in the spring of the year, as close to the winter as you can, but you got to travel to get there for a lot of people. So they might get there in the middle of the summer, later summer. There's no way you're going to live through the winter if you don't have some sort of shelter. So sod housing was the way that most people went. We're going to talk about wheat farming and dry farming a little bit later, and we're also going to talk about the beef cattle and the longhorns, but there's a picture of what you might have been looking at for later. So back to inventions. 5 inventions that contributed to the success of the plains. One of them was windmills. Okay, they don't have any water. There's no streams for the most part or rivers. So for a lot of people, they had to figure out where are we going to get water from. But we got a lot of wind. So the windmill is sort of the way they got around that. The windmill was actually used to pump the groundwater to the surface so that they could use it, and that made it easier for them to live there. Barbed wire is probably, outside of the railroad, probably the biggest game changer in the West, in the settlement of the plains, because it's going to change lives for both sides. And you've got people already living there, the Native Americans, and you've got the settlers who think it's now there. So barbed wire is going to be the way that the settlers claim their land, and it's going to be the way that they control the land. So for the Native Americans, their concept of land use is we share the land. It's ours when we're here. It's someone else's later, but we don't own it. It's not anyone's land. You can't own land. We believed you could actually own land, and that it was ours, and it was ours in the future, and we could sell it, and even when we're gone, it's still ours. So ranching and homesteaders use a lot of barbed wire, and that makes them able to protect their crops, and it gives them better control over their herds. But to the American Indian, it pretty much ruined their life because their life was predicated on being able to move all over the place. Use the land when they needed it, where they needed it, and not stay in one place too long. So this is called devil's rope to them because they can't move around because everything's all fenced off. And we'll talk about that a little bit in class. So another invention that was important was a steel plow. That was John Deere, and he invented a plow that would cut through the sod of the Great Plains, so the grass. The first time before you can plow something, obviously you have to get rid of the grass, and it had to be cut up. And the steel plow allowed them to keep working and to keep going straight without having to stop and unclog their plow. So it made work a lot easier, but you had to be able to buy one and get it there. So it was a little bit difficult for some people. Another invention, or adaptation, I guess, depending on which one you want to classify it as, is dry farming and wheat farming. Dry farming, they don't have very much rain, so they were, okay, what do we do? How do we make this work without rain? So what they would do is they would divide the fields into strips, and then they would plant on every other strip, and then one strip would sit for 2 years, and it would gather moisture. The soil below would get moisture, and it would help regenerate the land. And so it actually became popular. Wheat became the main crop. Red wheat especially, which we still grow around here today. There's 2 types of wheat that they grow, red wheat and white wheat. And red wheat worked really well this way. So it's still actually a main crop if you think of Kansas, Nebraska, the center of the country. Corn is grown there, and so is wheat. So their techniques allowed them to do that. Cattle ranching, you basically have a big pasture. It's a bunch of grass, and that's what cows need, are grass. And so the growing demand for beef, as people move into the cities in the northern part of the country, is important, and so they see an economic opportunity to raise cattle. The longhorn, the picture I showed you before, was the best suited because it could survive the harsh climate. It's not the best to eat because there's not as much meat on it as there would be on other types of cow. That's why you don't see people around here growing longhorns today. But it lived when others would die, so it was important for them. And we'll talk more about the cattle and ranching industry a little bit later. So the last kind of adaptation is sod houses, and I showed you some pictures before. They use them because there was no trees. You got to have a house of some sort, so they made it out of grass and sod, and that was probably an interesting adaptation, and we'll talk more about it in class, but it's sort of a living in a grass house, but that was better than nothing. So life on the plains is dictated by the geography. It's dictated by what's available, the way that they farm, the way that they act, the way that they survive. It's probably one of the more difficult places to live in the country. So a lot of the settlers, even though they got the 160 acres, a lot of them either died in the first 5 years or didn't make it through 5 years. So it was extremely difficult, and we'll talk more about that in class. So make sure if you missed anything, you go back and get it, but that's all we need to cover for